Do this.
That's right.
So cute, Reggie.
So, is there anyone here who wasn't here in the last class? No, you all approved it. Okay, good. It was extra syllable, I think we believe it. So, as you come in, there's going to be a outline right there in the corner. If you want to pick it up, I'll usually just leave them there because it just makes it easier for me to remember.
All right, guys.
You want to take an outline, folks, as you're coming in, please? It's right in the corner, right over there by the podium. I'll just usually leave them there because it makes it easier. Folks, is there anyone so far who has was not here last class and needs a syllabus? No, you're all repeated. Okay, good, perfect. Okay, folks, as you come in, you want to pick up an outline. I'll usually just leave them right there in the corner, so it's easy for me and you. Yeah, of course. Folks, does everyone have an outline and everyone has a syllabus, correct? Good. Outline. Okay, ladies and gentlemen. Just a few preliminaries before we get underway. Just about 11 o'clock. We'll start up. At this point, you all should have received an email from me about presentation. If you have not received email and you've been checking your email, let me know. And what I've done, as I told you, is completely randomly, more or less alphabetically, I've lined up what the groups are for presentations. Please check the list if you have not checked it already. Your name does appear on it twice because everyone's responsible for 2 presentations. And as I said, I'm more than happy to help groups as you begin to get together. And I know under these strange circumstances, if there's a circumstance that someone can't physically make it to class, it's absolutely fine for me if you record part of the presentation as projected. That does not bother me in the least bit. But you still in some way have to get in touch with the people in your group to find out who is doing what, so you can separate things out. Does that make sense? And I will help you as you go along with this process, but the first step is simply knowing what group you're in. All right. The other thing I want to introduce before we get to the heart of the matter material today is what's right in front of you, which is the outline. The reason for the outline, you want to pick up an outline as you come in, please. The reason for the outline, I'll normally just stick the outlines there because it's easy for me to just drop them off to the class, and then you can pick them up. The outline I hand out is very simple. I want to first of all give you some idea at the top section. What are the major themes I'll be covering in the course of the day? And especially if it's easy to get lost, you'll know what I consider to be the main points at any given moment. The second thing you have there is a list of terms. And the terms I include for a very simple reason, which is to say I'm going to be throwing a lot of terminology at you that will be very unfamiliar, or may well be unfamiliar. And what that term list is intended to do is to tell you, first of all, come on, it's intended to tell you how to spell these things, so I don't have to run to the board every single time I introduce a new term. And of course, it's later on to help you when you study, so then you're able to incorporate those terms as part of essays or anything you do with world history. Okay? So that's entirely for your use. And the third part is, I know you've done some reading for homework, and I personally, when I'm reviewing, I find it helpful to have some questions just to give you some idea of what I personally consider to be important about the reading, because there's a lot there. So that's the spirit I offer those questions to you. There are very few things in life you get for free. That is the spirit in which I give it to you. All of these things are meant to be a help to you. All right. And as I said, even if you're not in class, those are all posted on the Blackboard side of the class. And of course, if you lose the hard copy, you can always reprint it or just have it electronically. Make sense? All right. Great. One of the things that sometimes is a little bit befuddling about doing, especially ancient and into medieval history, is that you have to work a little bit with the dating system. And by that I mean how we report dates. This, of course, becomes very important in ancient history because as you're going to see, you're going to be starting with a system that may be somewhat unfamiliar to you. So I want to explain a little bit what it means. The system that most historians tend to use today when talking about ancient medieval dates is what's known as the BCE CE dating system. BCE, both of these are abbreviations. BCE stands before Common Era, ERA. CE stands for Common Era. You'll notice the reason I put this timeline here is this is how the dates work. BCE dates start from very high dates, and they go to low dates, and eventually you start counting up. And we are still in the Common Era. This is us approximately in this progression. This system was developed in Western Europe in the Middle Ages. Its approximate middle point, although it's not very precise, is the birth of Jesus. Up until recently, the system that people tended to prefer to measure dates was sometimes known as the BCAD system. BC being abbreviation for before Christ, AD being a Latin expression for the year of the Lord. All the dates for BCE are also the dates for BC. All the dates for CE are also the dates for AD. So if you look at an old textbook and it gives you the dates in AD or BC, there is no difference at all in the date system. The only difference is that many people who are historians were not necessarily Christian, didn't feel comfortable using this older system, and so they began to use this system, which uses the same exact dates and has the exact same middle point. Does this make sense? As I said, this will become, and for the purposes of this class, there's absolutely no difference. And if you want to be old-fashioned, you BC AD, there's absolutely no difference to me. Put the dates are the same. All right, with that small bit of matter out of the way, we can begin to get to what we're doing here. What is this discipline called history? The first thing I want to express to you is that history, unlike some of the subjects you'll learn in college, is an ancient discipline. It has existed for essentially as long as the Western tradition has existed. And it goes back, especially we usually say, to the ancient Greeks. This particular figure is known as Clio. Clio is one of these kind of mythological creatures that ancient Greek historians would pray to be able to gain inspiration, to be able to write history. The term itself, history, is one that actually does derive from ancient Greek. The term historia, in case you want to know it, simply means inquiry, investigation. Specifically, they meant it in terms of past events. So what is history exactly? Boiled down to its basics, what history is the narration of past events, specifically of human beings. Just want to pick up an outline as you sit down. Yeah, no. So what human beings have done, what we've enjoyed, what we've suffered. This is the heart and soul of history. Really, in some ways, history is navel-gazing. It is human beings studying and talking about ourselves. It is really something that is uniquely human. Dogs and cats do not have history with other animals, do not have histories in the way that we do. It's a human thing. Now, some of you, of course, will immediately protest. Well, don't historians often talk about things like plague? Don't we talk about things, for instance, about great natural calamities? And the answer is absolutely yes, we do. However, when historians talk about these things, my primary interest is not just, for instance, figuring out the biology of a pandemic. I want to know, first and foremost, what was the effect on human populations. So that would separate me in that case from a biologist who might want to know that sort of detail about the biology of it, or how exactly a storm comes about. That is less interesting to me as a historian. It's also important to note, as we do history, that I think sometimes people come to history with the idea that it is all already written, and basically all historians are doing is going back and reading the same old books again, and our basic framework is there. And what I would say to you instead is that history is always a narrative between the present and the past. We're constantly we're asking questions. We're sometimes going back and asking the same old questions, and we recognize that we answered them very badly in the past. Sometimes we have new sources, and all of a sudden that forces us to re-examine what we thought we knew already. So history is never sort of this discipline that is just sort of chiseled in stone. It's always being remade by modern historians. To some degree, of course, we always are forced to understand the past in our own terms because that is all we have. But we're always sort of trying our best to figure out how people in the past would have seen things differently, and it's a difficult endeavor. But I do think, as I mentioned to you in the first class, that ultimately doing this process will help us understand something about how our world has come to be. But again, bear in mind, this is very much a process. It's a process of collecting sources, analyzing them, interpreting them, and both using, and as I mentioned to you earlier, the old attitude with historians used to be that, well, we have to get all the written sources. And we certainly do. And we still have to get all the written sources, but now increasingly historians recognize that no understanding of the past is complete without physical sources from the past. Very often, again, generated things by archaeological digs that will bring up new sources. But sometimes it's just a matter of recognizing what we have already, the physical sources that we haven't actually looked at carefully in the past. As I mentioned to you, as part of this process, one of the most fundamental distinctions that historians make is between primary and secondary sources. The very simple definition I've given you for primary sources is that these are any material that's produced by the past civilization. Please.
So, like the pots and pans and stuff that you were talking about that we found in ancient times and the statues, would those be considered primary sources?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, and it is very important. I mean, they tell us different things. If I have a statue and if I have a written source, it might tell us enormously different things, but they're both primary sources. So, for instance, if I were interested in tracing, I don't know, the history of Greek statuary, that statue is going to prove to be very important. And I shouldn't just rely on written sources to tell me what statues were like. I can go see them myself. You both. Please.
Sorry, I have a weird question.
Yeah.
But was that picture of the library, is that Trinity College?
Yes, that is absolutely right.
Yeah, because I went there and I was like, wait, I've been there.
That was good identification. It was like a Google image search with the have in your brain. That was good. Yeah, that's absolutely right. You want to pick up an outline before you sit down. Primary sources, then again, any material is produced by one of these past civilizations. And as I said, both physical and written sources fall in this category. And these are what historians depend upon, because we don't really have primary sources. Writing the history of a particular place is extremely difficult. If we have no primary sources, then really, in essence, we're left in the dark often. Please.
So, if the Europeans, when they came to America, wrote about the Indians or the Native Americans that they found, is that a secondary source?
Oh no, it's a primary source, but you have to, with all primary sources, you have to treat them very carefully. And I think one of the valid questions you could ask is, did this person really know what they were talking about? And you may decipher something, well, yeah, they knew what they were seeing, they could describe this building, but they didn't really understand its customs. Just because it's a primary source doesn't necessarily mean it's a good primary source in all respects. You're still forced to evaluate it. Secondary sources, when I, as a modern historian, so that remove from what initially happened, I want to go and talk about something. I have a question that I want answered about the past. I first have to analyze the primary sources. Then I may produce a book, an article, a lecture that responds to that. And that is what a secondary source is. So it always means that I, as a historian, am going back to try to look at the primary sources and produce a good answer to my query, whatever it is. All right, well then, our task seems easy based upon the definition I've given you in terms of doing history. Once we locate humans, we can do history. Now, locating humans, however, is not an easy task in the least bit. And especially biologists spend a lot of time, and archaeologists, trying to figure out what exactly is the origin of the modern human, Homo sapiens is the Latin term. Rational or wise man, this is a Latin term. It is extremely difficult to figure out exactly what Homo sapiens arise, or when exactly, I should say, they arise. Very often, historians, not even historians, but those in related fields, have to deal with very limited fossil evidence. And in some cases, just one find can radically redate things significantly. Like this, for instance. Human beings, Homo sapiens, emerged approximately 200,000 years ago. And one of the things that really marks out their skulls is that we possess a very large brain. And again, there's obviously in the skull space for that brain, so we can see it immediately. And in fact, not only do we have a big brain, but it's particularly well developed in the frontal parts. Specifically in the places of the brain where conscious, reflective thought takes place. Really, in some ways, you may say, okay, well, who cares about our big brains? The reason we care about big brains is because this gives an edge to early human beings in their environment. I don't need to tell you, of course, that human beings, we don't have beaks, we don't have fangs, or we don't have anything on us that will allow or huge or sharp teeth. What we did have against all the forces of nature was our brains, and that is what gave us an advantage. Our intelligence, in fact, helped human beings in their contest and survive with other animals. It allowed people to, first of all, understand the world around us. It allowed us to communicate information to other humans. It allowed us to cooperate on complex tasks. So the brain is going to prove very important. And in particular, again, of all those skills, communication, we think, is key. What's another of the important physiological traits of human beings is not simply our big brain, but that we have a throat that has vocal cords that allows us to produce a huge range of sounds. And in fact, we end up having this separate cavity that has a tongue that, again, is very helpful in this process. And so that means that human beings can enunciate hundreds of different sounds and thus communicate messages with great subtlety. That's very important, no matter what language they spoke in. And of course, the ability to have language then allows us then, first and foremost, to survive, to live, to thrive. Without language, it's very difficult. It would have been difficult for humans to do so. So for instance, human beings could do things like they could use communication to hunt, but also then to survive in regions that otherwise would have been very difficult to do, to pass on knowledge. To go to areas that, for instance, are very cold and learn, for instance, how to use skins or shelters, those sort of things. Altogether, we think that in time, language is going to lead to something that we usually refer to as culture. Culture is one of those terms that is very difficult to define. Here I will provide just an easy definition that's relating to what we're talking about, which is to say that human beings can create change in our natural environment, and we can pass down that information to the next generation. This can be, for instance, how you're supposed to act. What are the rules of society? Again, culture is something, any of these things that if we figure out how we're supposed to act, how we're supposed to feed ourselves, how we're supposed to clothe ourselves, all of these things, what's important to human beings is that every single generation does not have to discover them. I don't have to, for instance, when I was born, I didn't have to discover what is the best way to gain nutrients from plants. I didn't have to discover how to create a roof over my head. Those things have been done in past generations and passed down to me. So if we can pass down this information, and it is cumulative. We keep getting more of this information and passing it down to future generations of human beings. And this is what culture is, in essence. And again, you may think about high culture, almost, artwork and things of that sort, but culture has much sort of a more baseline sort of level survival aspect to it. What tools should I use? How do I make clothing? How do I create a shelter for myself? Then we get to more complex things. What ideas are the right ideas to have? What beliefs? What is the language that we use? While the first generation of people, for instance, had to constantly learn things by trial and error, culture allows us to gain from their experience. So I, as a human being, I don't have to wander out into the forest, right, and say, is this poisonous? No, I guess so. That's the end of me. The next generation, however, can benefit from that and know, don't touch that. It'll kill you. We also, most of us would say, of course, that because of culture, because human beings too have this sort of a consciousness of themselves, we take a step above, beyond animals, that we don't simply react to nature by instinct. There's something that we have a conscious, reflective way to look at the world and to pass this knowledge down. All right, all of this may seem a bit abstract. When can we then start identifying humans, the actions, as you say, of modern humans, beyond just the biological samples of humans we have in the past? Well, the first great era usually people point to of human activity is known as the Paleolithic Age. Paleolithic is one of these funny old Greek terms that was created at a time where all modern historians and geologists knew Greek and Latin. So the term simply means old stone, Paleolithic. And what is very interesting to us about Paleolithic is that even as soon as we start to see activity of humans, they are spreading, spreading the world. And this map is really, again, only meant to give you a very vague idea of how this happened, of where this spread takes place. As many of you know, human beings first appear in Africa, and then what we see then is really a diffusion throughout the entire world. Again, especially initially to places like Europe, Asia, eventually further on, getting down to Australia. So as many of you will know, we'll talk about more later, some human beings will travel over the Bering Strait that separates modern day Russia and Alaska, and will travel into the Americas as well. And all the dates up here are approximate because we, in some cases, only have a vague idea of when exactly this happens. The basic reason we think because the human beings spread at this early stage is food. We tend to think that many of these human groups were following big game, big mammals that they wanted to hunt. And that is probably the reason, we can't really prove that, that is most likely the reason for the spread. The reason why we usually refer to this age as the Stone Age is simple. One of the best artifacts that we recover from the Paleolithic Age are stones. And hold on a second before you tell me that this sounds like the most boring archaeological find of all time. It's not, because these are not any old stones. These are not just stones that have been in nature. If you look closely, you'll notice that someone has worked on these stones. They've chipped away at them until they end up becoming sharper. And once you have a sharp stone, you can use it for all sorts of things. Killing animals, then dressing animals after they're already killed. And that's why we assume that they have these. These are weapons that human beings would use. We see that, again, we imagine that most of these stones would end up being at the end of things like spears. Occasionally, too, you find other tools from the Paleolithic, like things, for instance, like you notice this is a fish hook. People were also fishing in addition to killing big mammals as well. This is an artistic rendering of what we think some of the hunting in the Paleolithic was like, which is to say what we imagine based upon comparison with modern day peoples who live in a similar fashion, is that probably humans in the Paleolithic would tend to want to cause a stampede among mammals, try to get some of them off into areas like, for instance, swamps, that they could surround them, and then basically beat the hell out of them. Use any of the tools they had to kill the animal. And of course, the reason for big mammals is simple: lots of food. You kill one of these, your whole group is going to be eating well for a while at least. And by the way, if you ever wondered to yourself, why don't we have mammoths anymore? Mammoths were awesome. The reason for this are human beings in the Paleolithic. In fact, they become very good at killing some of these huge mammals. That's the point where in some cases they hunt them to extinction because they needed that food. The other way that we think that that human beings fed themselves in this age was by something we know as gathering. In fact, some people call human beings this age hunter-gatherers. The gathering part of that has to do with basically you go around in nature, you try to see what is growing, what kind of vegetation is growing that is edible, and they use that then to supplement their diet. The two of them. We think in this earliest age of human beings, we think that first of all, there are not many human beings around. They tend to die off pretty easily. And human beings who couldn't travel a lot tended to die off because the group was constantly on the move. We also think that there was relative equality in human beings in the Paleolithic. Everybody kind of did a little bit of everything. It was really hard to amass wealth because there was no real form of wealth that they could carry with them constantly. We also tend to think that most of these societies, the tasks in them were divided by gender. So women, especially who were less mobile because of childbearing, tended to do probably a lot of the gathering, but also things like, for instance, cooking, clothing making. Well, men tended to do a lot of the hunting. Now, lest you think, however, that human beings in the Paleolithic were just sat around all day and tried to feed themselves. We also see, even at this early stage, that human beings, there's an imaginative, artistic element to people's lives. And to give you some sense of this, I will show you just one example of the kind of find we have from the Paleolithic dig. Now, if you look at the first blush, what this appears to be is a bunch of seashells. And in fact, if you said that, you'd be right. The other thing to notice, though, is that what they have in all of them, which is to say, a little hole. And if you can imagine what this was for, what do you think? Yeah, that's exactly what we think. This is a necklace. The whatever tied it all together is gone. However, the seashells are still there. Now, what's interesting about this, of course, is that this necklace has no practical purpose. This is meant for simply ornamentation. But they were making them and wearing them. So clearly, human beings wanted to decorate themselves at this point. And we'll also occasionally see things like these little beads that people would decorate themselves with, too, on their clothing. One of the other main finds from Paleolithic, and you read a little bit about this tonight, was last night for this. These are things known as Venus figurines. Venus herself was actually an ancient Roman goddess of love. And so, in effect, the name is a little bit silly because people in the Paleolithic would not refer to these as Venus figurines, but we still do today because the term's been there for a long time. I think basically the exaggerated sort of breasts made some of the people who discover these think a lot about love, which is the reason they use the term Venus. Notice again these, especially because of the breasts. Sometimes people have seen these Venus figurines as being some sort of fertility goddess or something like that, which is possible. That they had maybe they had a ritual sort of use. Some people think that there were a bunch of basically like Barbie dolls for the Paleolithic. We really don't know exactly how they used these. We do know that we find them, though, all over the place in Paleolithic finds. Here's but boy, was she top heavy. The other main find, or the other sources that we have for the Paleolithic, is art that is done in caves. Right. Some of you may wonder, well, did they just do art in caves? They really liked doing work in caves? And the answer is, they probably did art all over the place. But in caves, the climate is such that we can actually have these preserved over the course of centuries, which is not true of art they would have done in other places. And in particular, one just very famous example of a cave in the Paleolithic are known as the Lascaux caves. These are caves that are located in modern-day southern France. But it's just one of many examples that I could have given you. And here I'll show you some of the examples of the kinds of art that we see from the Paleolithic, which is to say, animals, lots of animals. So we have a horse, probably, big horse. Stampede, potentially. Someone who did not make out well on the hunt. And notice again, in some cases, these really huge looming beasts, essentially. Yeah.
So is the cave in southern France, is that like a tourist attraction then?
It used to be. So many people came that eventually they were ruining the cave. So they sealed it up entirely. It's a little bit of a sad story, but yeah, at one point it was. When it was first discovered, people would just flow in. They created a replica, believe it or not, they call Lascaux 2. So it's not, like all sequels, it's not the same. What I really is interesting about these animals is notice that this is not naturalistic. A lot of this kind of art is weird, it's exaggerated. These things you don't see in nature, which means that it's not, some people think that in debating about what exactly this artwork was meant to do, some people think that they were just depicting things that they knew. They knew the hunt, they knew animals. And this may have been a part of it, but some people do think that there had to have been something else beyond this too. Who knows, that maybe they felt that just by depicting the animals, they would gain power over them. That's what some people think that these were meant. Or in some way, it was involved with rituals or their religious beliefs. All of these are possible. But the problem, of course, is that you can't grab someone from Paleolithic and say, what exactly were you doing when you painted these? We just have the results of what they made. All that does show, I should say by the end of it, it does show, by the way, that people in the Paleolithic had a conceptualizing power, that there really is imagination happening in this artwork. The second big era in early human life that we pick out is something known as the Neolithic age. And this is yet another funny Greek term that means new stone. If you look at this closely, you will see what I mean by new stone. You'll notice that the stones in this age are smooth. They were polished. And that is the major difference in the kind of stones we find in this era. However, you may think that the Neolithic is a complete bust if that's the only big difference. However, there is an even larger difference. And some people would say that this is probably the largest change in human society, that in fact the largest that would occur until the Industrial Revolution in the modern period. And so during the Neolithic, an event occurs that is referred to as the Agricultural Revolution. And in fact, this is very simply the spread of settled farming throughout the world. And the old attitude used to be, well, okay, farming started in one place and then everywhere got it. Nowadays, most people tend to think that there actually are several different areas in which farming starts, and then it begins to slowly spread until that becomes the dominant way to gain food throughout the world. Some of you may still say, well, okay, I know farming, and it doesn't seem like it's all that revolutionary to me. But that is simply because you never lived as a hunter-gatherer in the previous age, in which people had this existence that was constantly on the move. You didn't know where your food was coming from. It really, in some ways, was a very unstable way to live. All of this changes when people begin to plant and harvest and stay in one place during the Agricultural Revolution. First of all, what's so great about this period now is that when you learn how to farm, and it must have been a long process of trial and error, after you learn how to do this, you have a regular supply of food that comes up every year. This is not to say you can't supplement it, and of course, one of the other benefits of agriculture is you can domesticate animals and begin to raise them, so you also have that need, and you don't have to solely depend upon hunting, which can be an uncertain proposition at times. We think that, so that again, people begin then to domesticate cow, pig, sheep at the same time. So far, and there's always debates about exactly why the agricultural revolution occurs. We do think in part it is because the world begins to get slightly warmer, there's slightly more of a stable climate, and slightly more rain. So the climate is actually well suited to begin to the shift over to farming. We think that the real benefit of farming then ultimately is that because you have food on a regular, systematic basis, it means that the human population begins to rise significantly. There are more people around. This means that, of course, a lot more people live, and there's a lot less infanticide than occurs. In an earlier age, we think children couldn't be fed, basically, they were killed, or just left to be eaten. Most people tend to think that agriculture was in particular probably inspired by women who previously, in a hunter-gatherer age, we know had much more of a connection to vegetation. They knew what would grow initially, so probably they're the ones helping to usher in this new age. Strangely enough, though, most people tend to think that women, their positions are harmed, though, as a result of the agricultural revolution, because one of the other things that we see that creeps in after the agricultural revolution, one of the sort of darker sides, is there's a lot more hierarchy. There's a lot more of a ladder in society, because now all of a sudden there's a way to gain more wealth. There's a way to have a much more stable amount of money. So we see much more finer gradations of who's at the top, who's lower in society. And we also see almost inevitably after the agricultural revolution, the people who are dominating are men over women. So it ends up disadvantaging women ultimately. But again, this is and I don't mean to be ultimately negative about this. I mean, it is good to have more food. It is good to have surpluses too, have more food than you even need to be able to eat, which then allows you then to use that wealth more or less in a different way. However, some people would also say on a negative level too, when you have stuff, people want to steal it. So having surpluses also means that warfare probably becomes more of an endemic problem. Because now there's something to steal. And there's actually more of a benefit to going to war against your neighbors, because you take the food or anything else that they've managed to develop. So at least a part of this, let's just move on a little bit. Okay, at least a part of this leads to the last of the ages I'll discuss here, which is known as the Bronze Age. Having more war meant that people wanted to have better weapons than simply going to war with their stones. And so the next step is the development of metal. And although some people refer to this as the Bronze Age, in fact, it's not just bronze that people were beginning to develop. And in fact, probably first people begin to mine copper. And then little by little, they begin to figure out how to make, for instance, bronze, which is simply a combination of tin and copper together. Sometimes the very earliest signs of working with metal are really very crude, the examples we have. It's basically people taking metal out and slamming it to try to form something useful. Gradually, people begin to discover that that method is not really all that, it really does not produce what you want, and so people begin to learn to melt metals and begin to cast them into things that are a little bit more impressive. Like, for instance, again, here's an early example of a weapon. And so a lot of our early things in the Bronze Age are things of war, knives, axes, other kinds of weapons. This also, of course, leads people to have another way to be able to decorate themselves. People do also create jewelry, too. So it's not all just military usage. Here's just getting some good examples of early sort of working with bronze. Again, people really, really over a relatively short period of time become very good at working bronze and other metals. And just to get another, again, this example, obviously, of metal for a farm-based purpose. Like all of this surplus, all of this wealth that is now being created, allows for the development of something that is a little bit more complicated than the kind of society that we saw previously. It leads to the development of something that we refer to as civilization. And I promised you in this lecture, of course, I would get to civilization at some point, and that's where we are. Just like culture, civilization is one of those terms that everyone kind of knows, but it's very difficult to give a precise definition for. And in fact, very often in textbooks, what people will do is they will try to think about what are some of the symptoms, really, of civilization. What are some of the signs that people have arrived at civilization, rather than just give you a short definition. And some of the things that we see once civilization begins to develop are cities. And in fact, the term civilization comes from one of the Latin terms meaning city. So that is, for some people, one of the major signs of a civilization. We begin to see in civilizations trade where people do not have on a local level. On a broader phase, in civilizations, we see a lot of technological and social change. Things change a little bit more quickly than they did previously. Also, in civilizations, people begin to use symbols to communicate. Not always necessarily a fully developed language, but some kind of symbols we often see in civilizations. This is just one very early attempt of people to chart out how different civilizations, you don't have to read the details here, but I'm trying to figure out when different civilizations came about. Sometimes people also say with civilization, there's a certain level of complexity in the way people behave with one another than previously had seen. One of the major signs of civilizations, that we really see that civilizations come about, is we begin to see specialization of different jobs. So for instance, as I told you earlier, hunter-gatherers, everyone does a little bit of everything. That's not true anymore when a civilization comes about. You begin to see, for instance, one person's a food maker, one person is a priest, one person is a scribe, and the jobs begin to get parceled out to different people. Now, it's fair to say that although people used to create these models that say all civilizations basically occur according to one pattern, no one thinks that anymore. And in fact, civilizations, we think, for the most part, develop according to very different patterns. There's no one universal mold of how the civilization will come about. So, for instance, we know civilizations, we'll talk more about these too, who have developed without writing, and they're non-literate. We also know, for instance, that sometimes these same civilizations will get things, will get new technologies at a very different pace. To give you just one of many examples, the Chinese were able to cast iron approximately 1,500 years before anyone could do that in Europe. Both of them were civilizations, but they got the same stuff at very different times. And really, there's no way for us to just kind of sit back and say, this is how civilizations should develop. As historians, our question should be instead, how did they develop? We really have to begin to dig deep and look at that individual civilization, see what they got and when they got it, how did they grow. And this map just gives you some of the major civilizations, most of which at some point we will talk about more as we go on. All right. Now, all of this may seem a little bit frustrating to you, and you want to actually say, okay, well, I understand what civilization is. Can you give me an example? And I will. The one civilization I'll talk about today is one of our earliest examples. And this is a settlement known as Çatalhöyük. So right here, I have the spelling, slightly different spelling, I should say, more standardized on your outline there. And this is the one civilization we'll close by talking a little bit about how it worked. And you can see, by the way, right immediately, this is in south central Turkey, modern day Turkey, is where we have discovered this settlement. Although it's not necessarily the same in terms of climate today, we do think initially Çatalhöyük had a very favorable climate. In fact, it had a ready supply of water right in the area, which meant, of course, again, when in terms of civilization, you have to have food, you have to have agriculture, and they had it initially. So it was a well-chosen spot. So far as we can tell, Çatalhöyük started as a small, undistinguished little village that gradually simply grew to this bustling center, to the point where I would, again, and you can actually consider it to be one of our first identifiable civilizations. Eventually, it would have it would be around 15 acres that was settled and around 6,000 people. One of the reasons I absolutely love Çatalhöyük, among other reasons, you may think that having sidewalks is an obvious way to form your civilization, having sidewalks between buildings. But they had no roadmap to start from, and what they found much more logical is they created this basically this maze of mud brick houses that were all flushed together. There's no space. And how did you get around from one another? Not by the sidewalk, by people's roofs. They had a bunch of ladders that would basically connect you up between one house to the next, and that is how they would progress from place to place. It's an ingenious solution. It's not one that we really come with today, but it is one way to solve that problem of how you circulate those are the streets. The first thing we've discovered by looking at this dig is, first of all, the food they had. They knew how to plant wheat, barley, peas, some fruits, all of these things that suggest that this was an agricultural hot zone. And once you have food, once you have a surplus of food, you can then begin to use that wealth to do more interesting things. So for instance, they begin to manufacture pots. They begin to shape things from wood, carving. We also have examples like this one, for instance, of how they could create things from leather. They could create clothing, textiles. They have their own tools, weapons like these. They can begin to carve. And they have decorative things as well, beads and jewelry. All kind of things we were talking about, I should say. They're all concentrated here, and the finds are done in this place. And again, lest you think that these people just sat around all day and ate, we also can see that there are signs of higher level activity. We, for instance, see that there's some houses, one of which we suppose was something like a church, a miniature church, that was decorated by these kind of animal heads. That we think that potentially that was kind of a ritual center initially. That's what possibly they were doing there. And we find these kind of clay figures. That the supposition most people have made that these are probably some form of gods. So these were fertility gods because of the breasts. That's possible. We have no idea what her name was. And we see other, again, things that appear to be just artwork that were sculpted in this society. And we also see on top of these things, painting. And here, this is a good example, by the way, of the fact that people were doing painting outside of caves as well. And probably also in the past age, but definitely by the time we get to civilization, people are creating murals here with all sorts of animals in them. And here's a good one of a bull. We also can see just a taste of people's beliefs at Çatalhöyük. Well, one of the things that has often fascinated, for instance, people when they look at some of the burials done at this place is that this is not where people's heads tend to be when they're alive. We often see, sometimes we'll see a body buried and the head will be buried in a slightly different place, which makes us wonder, why did they do that? The answer could be that, again, there was some sort of ritual or religious belief. Maybe they hoped that these people wouldn't come back, and one of the ways they did it was to decapitate them before they buried them. That's one guess. This also is very hard to see. Just in case you were ever curious, though, this is the world's oldest landscape painting, including our first painting. It's hard to see, I realize. A volcano is actually done here as well. Now, this is just one foretaste. We'll be seeing many other civilizations in the course of our work together, but this is one just to get your mind rolling. Any final questions? Again, if there are questions about the groups, please let me know. Otherwise, I will see you on Monday. Thank you, folks.